The rain hit my face like cold slaps as I stood alone at my husband's grave, watching my children's taillights disappear into the storm. After everything I had sacrificed, after 35 years of putting them first, they had just driven away and left me there like I was nothing. Standing in that downpour, clutching wilted flowers that cost more than some people's weekly groceries, I made a decision that would change all our lives forever. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a mother's unconditional love can turn into something far more powerful when betrayal cuts deeper than any grave. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Thompson, and for 62 years I understood what family meant. I thought love was supposed to be unconditional, that sacrifice was supposed to be rewarded, and that the children you raise with every ounce of your being would stand by you when the world got dark. I was wrong about a lot of things, but I was right about one thing that mattered more than all the rest. I was right about my own strength, even when I didn't know I had it. The morning that would shatter everything I believed about my children started like any other October day in our small Connecticut town of Millbrook. The leaves were just beginning their spectacular autumn show, painting the maple trees outside my kitchen window in shades of amber and crimson that reminded me of better times. I had been awake since 5, as was my habit, preparing for what should have been a day of remembrance and family unity. Instead, it became the day I learned that the people I loved most in the world saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience. It was the 5th anniversary of my husband Robert's death, and we had planned to visit his grave together as a family. This ritual had become sacred to me, a way to honor the man who had been my partner for 37 years and the father who had shaped our 3 children into the adults they had become. Or so I thought. Robert had been a good man, not perfect, but devoted to our family in ways that seem almost quaint now. He worked 2 jobs for most of our marriage, first as a high school math teacher and then picking up weekend shifts at the hardware store. Also, I could stay home with the kids when they were young and pursue my passion for interior design once they were older. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Robert had been careful with money, almost obsessively so, saving and investing, with the methodical precision he brought to everything else in his life. He used to joke that he was building our fortress against the future, making sure that no matter what happened, our family would be secure. After he died from a sudden heart attack at 59, I discovered just how successful he had been. The life insurance, the retirement accounts, the carefully managed stock portfolio, the paid-off house, all of it added up to more money than I had ever imagined we possessed. But money, I learned, doesn't fill the hollow space left by the love of your life. For 5 years, I had been navigating widowhood with the support of my 3 children, or at least I thought I had their support. There was Michael, my eldest at 34, who worked as a financial advisor in Hartford and had always been the responsible one. He had inherited his father's analytical mind and his grandmother's sharp tongue, though I tried not to think about that second part too often. Then came Sarah, 31, a marketing executive in Boston who had her father's charm but seemed to have developed a hardness around the edges that worried me. Finally, there was Daniel, my baby at 28, who was still finding his way in the world as a freelance graphic designer, bouncing between apartments and relationships with the restless energy of someone who hadn't quite figured out what he wanted from life. They were all successful in their own ways, all college-educated, all seemingly well-adjusted adults who called regularly and visited for holidays. We had our ups and downs, as all families do, but I genuinely believed we were close. I believed they loved me the way I loved them, completely and without reservation. I believed that when the chips were down, we would stand together against whatever the world threw at us. Looking back now, I realize I had been seeing what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The morning of the cemetery visit, I spent 2 hours preparing. I made Robert's favorite apple cinnamon muffins, the recipe I had perfected over 20 years of marriage and still baked whenever I missed him most. I arranged fresh flowers in a beautiful bouquet, choosing the white roses he had always brought me for our anniversary and adding sprigs of rosemary for remembrance. I dressed carefully in the navy blue dress he had always said brought out my eyes, even though those eyes now carried lines that spoke of sleepless nights and tears shed in private moments. Michael arrived first, as he always did, prompt to the minute and carrying himself with the slightly impatient air of someone who had important places to be. He kissed my cheek dutifully and accepted a muffin, though he barely touched it while we waited for his siblings. When Sarah arrived 20 minutes late, she was already on her phone, fielding what she claimed was an urgent work call that couldn't wait. Daniel showed up last, looking like he had just rolled out of bed despite the fact that it was nearly noon. The drive to Oakwood Cemetery should have been a time for quiet reflection and shared memories. Instead, it became a preview of the abandonment that was coming. Michael drove his own car, claiming he had to leave early for a client meeting. Sarah rode with me but spent the entire 15-minute journey texting and making calls, her attention completely absorbed by whatever crisis was unfolding in her professional life. Daniel sat in the back seat with his earbuds in, nodding along to music only he could hear, and occasionally humming under his breath in a way that suggested he had completely forgotten where we were going and why. I tried to start conversations about their father, sharing memories I thought might spark their own recollections and draw them into the moment. I talked about how proud Robert would have been of Michael's recent promotion, how he would have laughed at Sarah's stories about her difficult boss, how he would have encouraged Daniel to keep pursuing his art even when the freelance work was slow. But my words seemed to bounce off them like rain off a windshield. They offered polite nods and minimal responses, their minds clearly elsewhere. When we reached the cemetery, the first drops of rain were just beginning to fall, tiny pinpricks of moisture that seemed to echo the unease growing in my chest. Robert's grave was in a peaceful section under a large oak tree, marked by a simple granite headstone that bore his name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Husband and Father," that I had chosen after days of agonizing over what words could possibly capture the enormity of what we had lost. I had expected this to be a solemn but meaningful time together, a chance to honor Robert's memory, and perhaps talk about how we had all grown and changed in the 5 years since his death. Instead, it felt like I was attending my own memorial service, surrounded by people who were counting the minutes until they could leave. Sarah was the first to break. She had been fidgeting and checking her phone every few seconds since we arrived, and when it rang for the third time in 10 minutes, she answered it right there at the graveside. "I have to take this," she said, not even bothering to lower her voice or step away from the headstone. "It's about the Morrison account." She launched into a heated conversation about campaign strategies and budget allocations while standing over her father's grave, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery like a profanity in a church. Michael, meanwhile, was checking his watch, with increasing frequency and shifting his weight from foot to foot like a runner waiting for the starting gun. When I tried to engage him in conversation about a story Robert used to tell about teaching Michael to drive, he cut me off mid-sentence. "Mom, I really need to get going. I have a 2:00 with the Hendersons, and you know how important that account is." Daniel was the most physically present, but the most emotionally absent. He stood beside the grave with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, staring off into the distance with the glazed expression of someone whose mind was miles away. When I asked him to share a memory of his father, he shrugged and said, "I don't really remember much. I was pretty young when he died." The dismissal hit me like a physical blow. Daniel had been 23 when Robert died, hardly a child, and they had shared countless experiences in those final years. Robert had spent hours helping Daniel with his portfolio for art school, had attended every one of his gallery showings, had been the one to encourage Daniel's creative pursuits when others suggested he needed a more practical career path. Idea that Daniel could claim not to remember seemed less like forgetfulness and more like willful amnesia. As the rain began to fall harder, I felt something shifting inside me. Not sadness, not hurt, but something colder and more crystalline. I was beginning to see my children not as the loving family members I had imagined them to be, but as strangers, who happened to share my DNA and my history, but not my values or my heart. "Maybe we should head back," Michael said, glancing up at the darkening sky. "This rain is really picking up." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I looked at the three of them, my life's greatest accomplishments, the people I had poured every ounce of love and sacrifice into for more than 3 decades. They were already mentally gone, already moving toward their cars and their important meetings and their busy lives that apparently had no room for honoring their father's memory or supporting their grieving mother. "Just a few more minutes," I said quietly. "I'd like to say goodbye properly." Sarah huffed with impatience, still clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Mom, I'm getting soaked. Can't you just say whatever you need to say quickly?" The rain was coming down harder now, turning the cemetery paths to mud and plastering my carefully styled hair to my head. But I didn't move. I stood there looking at Robert's headstone, thinking about the man who had built his whole life around making sure his family was taken care of. And I felt a rage building that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. "Fine," Michael said, raising his voice over the increasing downpour. "I'm leaving. I can't miss this appointment." He turned and started walking toward the parking area without another word, not even bothering to say goodbye to his father, or to me. Sarah was right behind him. "I'll call you later, Mom," she said, already moving away from the grave. "We really need to go." Daniel lingered for just a moment longer, and for a second I thought he might stay, might show some small sign that this moment mattered to him. Instead, he patted my shoulder awkwardly and said, "Take care of yourself, Mom. I'll catch up with you soon." And then they were gone, all 3 of them, hurrying through the rain toward their cars while I stood alone at their father's grave. I watched their taillights disappear into the storm, 3 separate vehicles carrying 3 separate lives that had apparently outgrown any need for the woman who had given them everything. The rain was pouring down now, soaking through my dress, and running in cold rivulets down my back. My carefully arranged flowers were already beginning to wilt, the white petals bruised and scattered by the wind. I should have run for cover, should have hurried to my own car and driven home to dry clothes and hot tea. Instead, I stood there in the downpour and let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about a cemetery, visit cut short by bad weather. This was about a pattern I had been too blind or too hopeful to see clearly. This was about 3 children who had learned to see their mother as a convenience rather than a person, who had grown comfortable taking my love for granted because they had never known a world where it wasn't freely given. As I stood there, getting drenched, I began to think about all the times I had rearranged my life to accommodate theirs. The holiday meals I had cooked for ungrateful audiences, the emergency loans I had provided without question, the babysitting I had done for Sarah's children while she built her career, the emotional support I had offered during their divorces and job changes and personal crises. I thought about how I had stepped back from my own interior design business after Robert died, not because I couldn't handle it, but because I thought my children needed me to be available for them during their grief. What I was beginning to understand standing there in the rain at my husband's grave was that they hadn't been grieving the way I had been grieving. They had processed their father's death and moved on with their lives, while I had remained frozen in a moment of loss, trying to hold our family together through sheer force of will and maternal devotion. But there was something else, something that went deeper than disappointment or hurt feelings. As the rain continued to pour down and I remained alone at Robert's graveside, I realized that I wasn't just angry about being abandoned in this moment. I was angry about being taken for, granted in every moment that had led up to this one. I thought about the conversation I had overheard last Thanksgiving, when Michael and Sarah thought I was in the kitchen, but I was actually just around the corner in the dining room. They had been talking about my finances, about how I was sitting on all that money and not doing anything productive with it. They had laughed about how I lived in the same house, drove the same car, and maintained the same modest lifestyle that Robert and I had always shared, as if my lack of extravagance was somehow foolish or disappointing. I remembered Sarah's comment about how I could afford to help Daniel with a down payment on a condo, and Michael's agreement that I should be more generous with what he called Dad's legacy. At the time, I had pushed the conversation out of my mind, telling myself they were just worried about my future security. Now I wondered if their concern had been more about their own future inheritance than my present well-being. Standing there in the rain, I began to see my children's behavior through a different lens. The quick visits that never lasted more than a few hours. The phone calls that were always about their problems, their needs, their achievements, with barely a question about my own life. The way they had started treating my house like a hotel when they visited, expecting meals and laundry and entertainment without offering to help or contribute. The rain was coming down so hard now that I could barely see Robert's headstone through the sheets of water. My dress was completely soaked, my shoes were caked with mud, and my hair was plastered to my head like a drowning victim. But I didn't move. I stood there and let myself feel the full force of the storm, both the one raging around me and the one building inside me. Because something was becoming clear to me in that moment. Something that had been buried under years of maternal instinct and unconditional love. My children didn't just take my love for granted. They had begun to take me for granted. They saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. They had grown comfortable with the idea that I would always be there, always be available, always be willing to put their needs before my own. The final insult came as I was finally preparing to leave the cemetery. As I bent to place the now bedraggled flowers on Robert's grave, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Sarah. "Sorry we had to rush off. Can you pick up Emma from school on Wednesday? I have a client dinner I can't miss." Not an apology for abandoning me in the rain. Not a word about the significance of the day or the pain of the anniversary. Just another request for a favor, sent within minutes of leaving me alone at their father's grave. The casual assumption that I would of course be available, that my time and energy belonged to them by default, hit me like a slap across the face. I stood there in the pouring rain, staring at that text message, and I felt something inside me break. Not my heart, that had been broken 5 years ago when Robert died. What broke was my willingness to be invisible in my own life. What broke was my acceptance of being treated like a service provider rather than the woman who had given these 3 people everything I had to give. I typed back a single word. No. Then I put my phone away, said goodbye to Robert in the privacy of my own mind, and walked through the rain to my car. As I drove home through the storm, windshield wipers struggling against the downpour, I began to think about Robert's fortress against the future in a completely different way. He had built that financial security for our family, yes, but he had built it for the family we thought we were raising, not the family that had just abandoned me in a cemetery. He had saved and invested and planned for people who would honor his memory and cherish his widow, not for people who would treat both as inconveniences to be managed around their busy schedules. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a decision that would have shocked the woman I had been that morning. I was going to stop being taken for granted. I was going to stop being invisible. And I was going to make sure that my children understood exactly what they had lost when they chose their convenience over my dignity. The fortress Robert had built was going to become my weapon. And the children, who had abandoned me in the rain, were about to learn that their mother was stronger, smarter, and more determined than they had ever imagined. But first, I had some research to do. Because if I was going to change the rules of our family dynamic, I was going to do it with the same methodical precision that Robert had brought to building our financial security. I was going to be strategic, careful, and absolutely devastating in my effectiveness. The rain continued to pour as I sat in my car in the driveway, but for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I was about to gain. My children thought they knew their mother. They were about to discover they had never really known me at all. That evening, as I sat in my living room with a cup of chamomile tea and my laptop, I began to understand just how naive I had been about my own children. The rain had finally stopped, but the storm inside me was just beginning to gather force. I had spent the drive home thinking about patterns, about the small moments I had dismissed or rationalized away, and now I was ready to examine them with the clarity that only comes from having your illusions shattered completely. I opened a new document on my computer and started typing. Not a letter, not a journal entry, but a timeline. I wanted to see exactly when and how my children had transformed, from the loving, grateful people I thought I was raising into the entitled strangers who had driven away from me in the rain. What I discovered as I worked through the years was both illuminating and heartbreaking. The shift had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed it happening. Like watching someone age day by day, the changes were too subtle to register until you stepped back and looked at the whole picture. But as I traced the progression from Robert's death to the present moment, I could see the clear trajectory of how my children had learned to take advantage of my grief and my desperate need to keep our family together. It started almost immediately after the funeral. I had been drowning in paperwork, insurance claims, and the overwhelming logistics of death when Michael had stepped in to help. At the time, I had been so grateful for his assistance, so relieved to have someone handle the financial details while I struggled just to get through each day. He had taken over the management of Robert's accounts, helped me understand the insurance payouts, and guided me through the process of consolidating our assets. What I hadn't realized then was that his helpfulness came with a price. Not a financial one, but an emotional one. In allowing him to take control of those practical matters, I had inadvertently signaled that I was helpless, that I needed to be managed and protected rather than consulted and respected. Michael had carried that assumption forward into every interaction we had since then, treating me like a well-meaning but incompetent child who needed his guidance to navigate the complexities of adult life. The pattern had been reinforced by my own behavior. Whenever one of my children called with a problem, I dropped everything to help. When Sarah was going through her divorce 3 years ago, I had flown to Boston and stayed for 2 weeks, cooking her meals, watching her children, and providing emotional support while she fell apart. When Daniel lost his biggest client last year, I had quietly transferred money into his account to cover his rent and expenses without him even asking. When Michael's son needed expensive tutoring to get into the private school his parents wanted, I had written the check without hesitation. Each act of generosity had been motivated by love, by my deep desire to see my children succeed and be happy. But as I sat there cataloging these moments, I began to see them through a different lens. My children hadn't seen these gestures as expressions of love. They had seen them as evidence of my availability, proof that their needs would always take precedence over my own. The realization that hurt the most was how they had talked about Robert's death in the years since it happened. Not the public conversations where they spoke with appropriate sadness about missing their father, but the private comments I had overheard or half remembered. Sarah once mentioned to a friend that Robert's death had been actually kind of a blessing because it meant I would be available to help with her children. Michael had told his wife that my widowhood was working out well because it gave me purpose and kept me from being lonely. They had reframed my greatest loss as their greatest gain, and I had been too blinded by my own grief and my need to maintain family connections to see what they were really saying. They weren't grieving their father's absence the way I was. They were celebrating their mother's increased availability. As I continued my timeline, I found more evidence of their shifting attitudes. The way they had started visiting less frequently once they realized I would always come to them. The way they had stopped calling just to check in, instead only reaching out when they needed something. The way they had begun treating my house like their personal hotel, arriving with laundry and leaving with care packages they hadn't asked for but clearly expected. I thought about last Christmas, when all three of them had come home for the holiday. I had spent weeks preparing, decorating the house, shopping for gifts, planning elaborate meals. I had bought presents for their children, their spouses, even their pets. I had stayed up until midnight on Christmas Eve wrapping everything perfectly, making sure each package looked like it had come from an expensive boutique. On Christmas morning, they had opened their gifts with polite enthusiasm, but I could see the calculation in their eyes. Michael had immediately researched the value of his new watch online. Sarah had asked if I had kept the receipt for her purse. Daniel had seemed more interested in the cash I had tucked into his card than the art supplies I had carefully selected based on his current projects. But what had really stung was the gifts they had given me in return. A generic candle from Michael, still in the pharmacy bag with the price tag attached. A coffee mug from Sarah that I suspected had been a promotional item from her office. Nothing from Daniel except a hastily scrawled card that looked like he had picked it up from the hospital gift shop on his way to my house. The disparity hadn't been about money. All three of my children were doing well financially, certainly, well enough to put thought and effort into choosing meaningful gifts for their mother. The disparity had been about care, about the level of attention they felt I deserved, versus the level of attention they expected from me. As I typed these observations into my document, I felt the anger building again. Not the hot, explosive anger of the cemetery, but something colder and more focused. I was angry at them for taking advantage of my love, but I was also angry at myself for allowing it to happen. I had trained them to treat me this way through my own behavior, through my willingness to always give more than I received and never demand the same level of consideration I showed them. I thought about the conversations I had overheard about my money, about their casual assumptions that Robert's life insurance and investments would eventually be theirs. They had never asked me about my plans for the money, never suggested that I might want to travel or pursue hobbies or donate to causes I cared about. They had simply assumed that I would continue living my modest lifestyle and preserve their inheritance for them. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that they had been managing me for years, subtly but systematically ensuring that I remained available for their needs while my own needs went unexamined and unmet. They visited just enough to maintain the relationship, but not enough to be inconvenienced. They called just often enough to seem caring, but never at times that were inconvenient for them. They included me in their lives just enough to keep me invested, but never enough to give me real influence or agency. I closed my laptop and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Robert and I had planted together in the early years of our marriage. The roses were still blooming despite the late season, their red petals bright against the darkening sky. Robert had always said that roses were like good relationships. They required attention and care, but they rewarded that investment with beauty and resilience. Our marriage had been like that. We had weathered difficulties together, supported each other through challenges, and created something beautiful and lasting. But my relationships with my children had become something else entirely. I had been doing all the tending while they had been doing all the taking, and the result wasn't a garden, but a wasteland. Standing there in the growing darkness, I began to think about what Robert would say if he could see how our children were treating me. He had been protective of me in life, quick to defend me when anyone suggested I was too generous or too trusting. He had loved our children deeply, but he had also seen their flaws clearly. He wouldn't have tolerated the way they were treating me now, and I realized that by accepting their behavior, I was dishonoring his memory as much as they had dishonored it by abandoning me at his grave. That's when I made my second decision of the day. I wasn't going to confront my children directly about their behavior. I wasn't going to have emotional conversations about how they had hurt me or demand apologies for their selfishness. That approach would only lead to defensiveness and excuses, and it would ultimately change nothing. Instead, I was going to change the terms of our relationships quietly and systematically. I was going to withdraw my availability and see how they responded when the well of maternal generosity they had been drinking from suddenly ran dry. I was going to stop being the person who always said yes and start being the person who had her own priorities and boundaries. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was working with. I needed to know the full extent of how they saw me and what they expected from me. So I decided to conduct a little experiment. The next morning, I called Michael's office. When his secretary answered, I asked to speak with him about an urgent family matter. She put me through immediately, and I could hear the concern in his voice when he picked up. "Mom, what's wrong? Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said calmly. "I was wondering if you could help me with something. I'm thinking about selling the house and moving to a retirement community. I wanted to get your thoughts on the best way to handle the financial aspects." There was a long pause. Then Michael's voice, suddenly much cooler, said, "Mom, that seems like a pretty drastic decision. Have you really thought this through? I mean, the house is paid off and it's a great investment. Why would you want to sell it?" "Well," I said, maintaining my casual tone, "I'm getting older and the upkeep is becoming more difficult. Plus, I thought it might be nice to have more liquid assets to enjoy while I'm still healthy enough to travel and pursue new interests." Another pause, longer this time. "What kind of new interests?" he asked, and I could hear the suspicion creeping into his voice. "Oh, I don't know. Maybe a cruise around the world. I've always wanted to see Australia and New Zealand. And I've been thinking about taking art classes, maybe even buying a studio space where I could paint." "Mom," Michael said, and now his voice carried the tone he used with clients who were making poor financial decisions, "I really think you should slow down and consider this more carefully. Making major life changes when you're feeling emotional isn't usually a good idea. Why don't we have lunch this weekend and talk it through?" I smiled to myself. Michael, who had been too busy for a proper visit to his father's grave, suddenly had time for lunch when he thought I might be about to spend his inheritance. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, "but I'm actually meeting with a real estate agent tomorrow. I want to get the process started as soon as possible." "Mom, wait," he said, and I could hear the panic beginning to creep in. "You don't need to rush into anything. Let me do some research on retirement communities in the area. Maybe we can find something that would work better than selling the house." "Oh, I'm not looking at places around here," I said cheerfully. "I'm thinking about somewhere warmer. Maybe Florida or Arizona. Somewhere I can start fresh." The silence that followed was so long I wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm. "Mom, you can't just move across the country. What about family? What about your grandchildren?" "Well," I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me, "I assumed you were all too busy with your own lives to see me very often anyway. Yesterday at the cemetery made that pretty clear." "That's not fair," he said quickly. "We all had commitments we couldn't break. That doesn't mean we don't want to spend time with you." "I'm sure that's true," I said mildly. "But since you're all so busy, I thought this might be the perfect time for me to pursue my own interests without worrying about being available for family obligations." I could practically hear Michael's mind racing as he tried to figure out how to respond to this unexpected development. Finally, he said, "Look, I think there might have been some miscommunication yesterday. Why don't we plan a family dinner this weekend, all of us together, so we can talk about this properly?" "That sounds lovely," I said, "but I'm actually quite busy this weekend. I'm meeting with my financial advisor on Saturday to discuss liquidating some investments, and on Sunday I'm touring a few retirement communities online." Your financial advisor? Michael asked, his voice rising slightly. Which financial advisor? I thought I was helping you with that stuff. Oh, you've been wonderful, I said warmly. But I realized I need someone who specializes in retirement planning for single women, someone who understands my specific needs and goals. I could hear Michael breathing heavily through the phone. Mom, I really think we need to sit down and talk about this face to face. How about I come over tonight after work? I'm sorry, but I have plans tonight, I said. I'm having dinner with my neighbor, Eleanor. She's been giving me advice about living independently as a widow. This was true, though the dinner had only been arranged an hour earlier when I had called Eleanor and suggested we get together. Eleanor Walsh was a spunky 70-year-old who had been widowed for nearly a decade and had spent the intervening years traveling the world, taking classes, and generally living life on her own terms. She was exactly the kind of role model I needed at this moment. Fine, Michael said, his professional composure finally cracking. But I want you to promise me you won't make any major decisions before we have a chance to discuss this as a family. Of course, I said sweetly. I wouldn't dream of making major decisions without considering how they might affect the people I care about. I learned that lesson yesterday. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and smiled. Within an hour, my phone rang twice. First Sarah, then Daniel. Both calls followed the same pattern. Initial concern about my well-being, followed by carefully probing questions about my plans, followed by urgent requests to get together and talk things through. Sarah was particularly transparent in her motives. Mom, Michael told me you're thinking about selling the house. I just want to make sure you're not being pressured into anything. There are a lot of scammers out there who target older women, especially widows with assets. The implication that I was too naive or incompetent to make my own financial decisions was exactly the kind of condescension I had been dealing with for years, but now I could see it clearly. Sarah wasn't worried about my being scammed. She was worried about her inheritance being spent. Daniel's approach was different, but equally revealing. Hey, Mom, I heard you're thinking about some big changes. That's cool. You should totally do whatever makes you happy. But maybe I could crash at the house for a while before you sell it. I'm between apartments right now, and it would save me a ton of money on rent. Even when confronted with the possibility that I was about to dramatically change my life, Daniel's primary concern was how it might benefit him. Not whether I was making the right decision, not whether I needed emotional support during a difficult transition, but whether he could take advantage of the situation to solve his own housing problems. That evening, as I sat across from Eleanor at her kitchen table, sharing a bottle of wine and a home-cooked meal that was infinitely more enjoyable than the rushed interactions I usually had with my children, I told her about my experiment. Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or raising an eyebrow, but mostly just letting me talk through what I had discovered about my family dynamics. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in her glass and looking thoughtful. You know, she finally said, when Harold died, my children went through a similar phase. Not as extreme as what you're describing, but there was definitely a period where they seemed to see me more as a resource than as a person. I leaned forward, interested. Eleanor rarely talked about the early years of her widowhood, though. I knew her husband had died suddenly like Robert. How did you handle it? I asked. Eleanor smiled, but there was something sharp in her expression. I stopped being available, she said simply. I started saying no to things that didn't serve my interests. I began making plans that didn't revolve around their schedules or their needs, and I made it clear that my money was mine to spend as I saw fit, not theirs to inherit as they expected. What happened? They threw quite a few tantrums at first, Eleanor said with a chuckle. Lots of guilt trips about how I was abandoning my grandchildren and being selfish with my time and money. But eventually, they realized that the old version of their mother wasn't coming back, and they had to decide whether they wanted a relationship with the new version. And did they? Want a relationship with the new version? Eleanor's smile became warmer. 2 of my 3 children did. My daughter Jessica adapted pretty quickly once she realized I wasn't going to change my mind. She started actually asking about my life instead of just telling me about hers. My son Mark took a little longer, but he came around too. They both have much healthier relationships with me now. What about the 3rd child? Eleanor's expression grew sad. My son Peter never could accept that I had become my own person instead of just his mother. He's still waiting for me to go back to being the woman who lived for her children's approval. We speak occasionally, but it's surface level. He made his choice. I thought about that as Eleanor and I moved to her living room for coffee and dessert. The idea that I might lose one or more of my children permanently was painful, but it was also oddly liberating. For the first time in years, I was contemplating the possibility that my relationships with my children might be improved by becoming more honest rather than more accommodating. The thing is, Eleanor said as she settled into her favorite armchair, once you stop trying to buy your children's love with your availability and your money, you find out whether they actually love you for who you are. And that's scary, but it's also necessary. What if they don't? I asked quietly. What if they only valued me for what I could do for them? Eleanor looked at me with the kind of compassion that only comes from someone who has walked the same difficult path. Then you'll know the truth, she said. And the truth, even when it's painful, is always better than living a lie. As I drove home that night, I thought about Eleanor's words and about the phone calls I had received from my children. Their sudden interest in my well-being had been revealing in ways they probably didn't realize. None of them had asked if I was happy, or lonely, or fulfilled. They had only asked about the practical implications of my potential decisions and how those decisions might affect them. I thought about Sarah's comment about scammers targeting widows with assets. The irony was that if anyone had been taking advantage of my widowhood and my assets, it was my own children. They had been systematically training me to give without receiving, to prioritize their needs over my own, and to see my role in their lives as primarily financial and logistical, rather than emotional and personal. When I got home, I found 3 voicemails waiting for me. All from my children, all with variations of the same message. They were concerned about my sudden decision-making and wanted to get together as soon as possible to discuss my plans. Michael had even suggested bringing his wife, Jennifer, to help provide perspective. I deleted all 3 messages without returning the calls. For the first time in 5 years, I was going to make my children wait for my attention instead of dropping everything to respond to their needs immediately. It was a small step, but it felt revolutionary. Before I went to bed, I opened my laptop and continued working on my timeline document. But now I was adding a new section, a plan for the future. Not the future my children expected, where I would continue to be their reliable, available, endlessly giving mother, but the future I was beginning to envision for myself. I started with small changes. I would stop automatically saying yes to requests for babysitting, loans, or emergency assistance. I would start making my own plans and sticking to them even when my children needed something. I would begin spending my money on things that brought me joy rather than hoarding it for people who saw it as their eventual inheritance. But I also started thinking about bigger changes. Real estate agents I could call, travel destinations I had always wanted to visit, classes I could take, hobbies I could pursue, friendships I could develop with people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. As I typed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Excitement about my own future. For the first time since Robert's death, I was thinking about what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. I was imagining a life where my own happiness was the primary consideration, where my time and energy were invested in pursuits that fulfilled me rather than in maintaining relationships that had become one-sided and draining. The rain had stopped completely, and through my bedroom window, I could see stars beginning to appear in the clearing sky. Tomorrow would bring another round of phone calls from my children, more attempts to manage and manipulate me back into my familiar role. But tonight, I was planning my escape from that role, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt like the protagonist of my own story, rather than a supporting character in theirs. The fortress Robert had built was about to become my liberation fund, and the children who had taken my love for granted were about to discover that their mother had both a backbone and a bank account they had seriously underestimated. The next morning brought exactly what I expected: a coordinated assault from my children designed to bring me back in line. By 8 a.m., my phone had rung 6 times, my email had 3 urgent messages, and Michael had even sent a text saying he was taking the day off to come discuss my situation. The speed and intensity of their response told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they took the threat to their expected inheritance. I let the phone ring while I made myself a proper breakfast, something I hadn't done in months. Fresh coffee, scrambled eggs with herbs from my garden, toast with the expensive jam I usually saved for special occasions. As I ate slowly at the kitchen table, savoring each bite, I watched the morning light filter through the windows and felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since Robert's death, I was putting my own needs first. And the world hadn't ended. When Michael arrived at 9:30, he looked like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He burst through the front door without knocking, something he hadn't done since he was a teenager, and found me in the living room reading a book about retirement communities in Tuscany. "Mom, we need to talk," he said, settling heavily into Robert's old chair without being invited to sit. "This whole thing about selling the house and moving away, it's not like you. You're not thinking clearly." I marked my place in the book and looked at him with the kind of patient expression I might give a child having a tantrum. "Good morning to you too, Michael. Would you like some coffee?" "I don't want coffee," he said impatiently. "I want to understand what's gotten into you. Yesterday you seemed fine, and now suddenly you want to uproot your entire life. It doesn't make sense." "What doesn't make sense about a 62-year-old woman wanting to enjoy her remaining years?" I asked mildly. "I've been living in the same house, following the same routines for 5 years. Maybe it's time for a change." Michael leaned forward, his financial advisor persona fully engaged. "Mom, you've built a good life here. You have history in this house, memories of Dad, established routines that work for you. Why would you want to throw all that away to move somewhere you don't know anyone?" I studied his face, noting the way his eyes kept darting around the room as if he was cataloging assets. "You seem very concerned about my emotional well-being all of a sudden. That's interesting, considering you couldn't spare an extra 10 minutes at your father's grave yesterday." Michael's face flushed. "That was different. I had a work commitment that I couldn't break. But this conversation is about your future, not about yesterday." "Is it?" I asked. "Because it seems to me that yesterday revealed quite a lot about how my children view their obligations to me versus how I view my obligations to you." Before Michael could respond, the front door opened again, and Sarah rushed in, still in her work clothes from the night before. She must have driven straight from Boston after getting Michael's panicked phone call. "Mom," she said, dropping her purse and laptop bag by the door. "Michael told me about your plans. Are you feeling okay? Have you been to the doctor recently?" I had to admire their strategy. First, question my mental competence. Make it seem like any desire to change my life was evidence of cognitive decline or emotional instability. It was both insulting and predictable. "I'm feeling better than I have in years, actually," I said. It's amazing how liberating it can be to start putting yourself first for once. Sarah sat down on the couch across from me, adopting the concerned, nurturing tone she used with her children when they were sick. "Mom, I know you've been lonely since Dad died. We all know that. But making drastic life changes isn't the answer. What you need is more family time, more connection with the people who love you. The people who love me, I repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Sarah, when was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? Not to ask for babysitting or advice or help with something, just to talk. Sarah blinked, clearly taken aback by the question. I call you all the time. You call me when you need something, I corrected gently. There's a difference. Daniel arrived 20 minutes later, looking like he had slept in his car. His hair was sticking up in odd directions, and he was wearing the same clothes from the cemetery visit. He surveyed the scene in the living room and immediately grasped that this was some kind of family intervention. So what's the crisis? He asked, flopping into the remaining chair with the casual disregard for furniture that had driven Robert crazy when Daniel was a teenager. Mom wants to sell the house and move to Florida or Arizona, Michael said tersely. She's talking about liquidating investments and spending money on world cruises and art studios. Daniel perked up at this information. Art studios? That's actually pretty cool, Mom. Are you thinking about getting back into painting? For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that at least one of my children might support my desire for independence and self-discovery. Then Daniel continued, because if you're getting rid of stuff, I could really use some of Dad's tools. And maybe that desk in the basement? I've been looking for a good workspace, and it would save me a ton of money if I didn't have to buy furniture. The hope died immediately. Even when Daniel seemed to be supporting my plans, he was actually just figuring out how to benefit from them. I looked at the three of them sitting in my living room, each one focused entirely on how my potential life changes might affect them, and I felt something click into place in my mind. I have a question for all of you, I said, setting down my book and folding my hands in my lap. When you think about me, about who I am as a person, what comes to mind? They exchanged glances, clearly sensing a trap, but not sure where it was leading. Sarah spoke first. You're our mother. You're caring and generous and always there when we need you. You're responsible, Michael added. You're good with money and practical about making decisions. You're patient, Daniel offered. You never get mad even when we screw up. I nodded slowly. So when you think about me, you think about what I do for you, not who I am as an individual person with my own interests and desires and dreams. That's not true, Sarah protested. We care about you as a person. Really? I asked. Can any of you tell me what my favorite book is? What I wanted to be when I was young, before I became a wife and mother? What I dream about doing now that I have the freedom to pursue my own interests? The silence that followed was deafening. They looked at each other and then back at me, clearly struggling to come up with answers to questions that had apparently never occurred to them. See, I said gently. This is what I've been realizing. For the past 5 years, I've been so focused on being available for all of you that I've forgotten to be available for myself. And you've been so accustomed to having me in that role that you've never thought to ask who I might be outside of it. Michael cleared his throat. Mom, I think you're being a little unfair. Of course we care about you as a person. We're just concerned that you're making hasty decisions based on emotions rather than logic. What's emotional about wanting to live my own life? I asked. What's hasty about a 62-year-old woman deciding to spend her own money on her own happiness? It's not about the money, Sarah said quickly, though the slight flush in her cheeks suggested otherwise. Isn't it? I asked. Because all three of you seemed remarkably unconcerned about my happiness yesterday when you left me standing in the rain. But the moment I mention possibly spending some of your father's insurance money on myself, suddenly you all have time for family meetings. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, you're making it sound like we only care about you because of money. That's not fair. Then prove it, I said simply. Show me that you care about my happiness more than Your inheritance. Support my decision to make changes in my life, even if those changes mean less money for you eventually. Another long silence. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads as they tried to figure out how to respond without revealing their true priorities. Finally, Michael spoke. Mom, it's not about the money. It's about making sure you're secure in your old age. Dad would want us to make sure you're taken care of. Your father would want me to be happy, I replied firmly. He would want me to live a full life, not to sit in this house like a museum curator preserving everything exactly as it was when he died. But what if you run out of money? Sarah asked. What if you spend everything on travel and art classes and then can't afford medical care when you're older? I smiled at her, and for the first time in the conversation, I felt genuinely amused rather than disappointed. Sarah, your father left me very well provided for. I could live quite comfortably for the rest of my life even if I spent $100,000 a year on pure indulgence. The money isn't going anywhere. There will still be plenty left for you when I'm gone. $100,000 a year? Daniel asked, his eyes widening. How much money is there exactly? More than enough, I said calmly. But that's not really the point, is it? The point is that it's my money to spend as I choose, and I'm choosing to spend some of it on making myself happy while I'm still alive to enjoy it. Michael stood up abruptly and began pacing the room. Mom, I think you need to slow down and really consider what you're saying. You're talking about making major life decisions based on one bad day. That's not rational. One bad day? I repeated, my voice growing sharper. Michael, yesterday wasn't one bad day. Yesterday was the culmination of 5 years of being taken for granted by the 3 people I love most in the world. That's not true, Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. When was the last time any of you visited me just because you wanted to spend time with me? I asked. Not because you needed babysitting or help with something, but just because you enjoyed my company? They looked at each other again, and I could see the realization dawning that they couldn't answer the question. When was the last time any of you called to ask about my day without having something you needed from me first? More silence. When was the last time any of you considered what I might want or need before asking me to rearrange my schedule? For your convenience? Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, we didn't realize. You didn't realize because you never asked, I interrupted. For 5 years, I've been so grateful for any contact from you that I never demanded the same consideration you expect from me. But yesterday, standing alone at your father's grave while you all drove away to your important appointments, I realized that gratitude without reciprocity isn't love. It's exploitation. The word hung in the air like a slap. Sarah's face went pale. Michael stopped pacing, and Daniel actually flinched. Mom, Sarah said carefully. That's a very strong word. It's the right word, I said firmly. You've been exploiting my love for you, my grief for your father, and my desire to maintain family connections. You've trained me to give without receiving, to ask for nothing while providing everything, and to put your needs ahead of my own happiness. Michael sat back down, his professional composure cracking. We never meant for you to feel that way. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact, I replied. And the impact has been that I've spent 5 years living as a supporting character in your lives instead of as the protagonist of my own. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Robert and I had spent so many happy hours together. Your father and I planted those roses 20 years ago, I said without turning around. Do you know why we chose roses? None of them answered. Because roses require attention and care, but they reward that investment with beauty and resilience. A good relationship is like that. Both people tend to it, both people invest in it, and both people benefit from the result. I turned back to face them. But that's not what we have anymore. I've been doing all the tending while you've been doing all the taking, and the result isn't a garden, it's a wasteland. So what are you saying? Daniel asked quietly. That you don't want to be our mother anymore? The question broke my heart a little, but I could see that it came from genuine confusion rather than malice. Daniel, perhaps more than the others, truly didn't understand what he had been doing wrong. I'm saying that I want to be your mother in a way that honors both of us, I replied. I want relationships where my happiness matters as much as yours, where my time is respected as much as yours, where my dreams are supported as much as I've supported yours. What do you want from us? Sarah asked, and for the first time in the conversation, she sounded more curious than defensive. I want you to get to know me as a person, not just as your mother, I said. I want you to consider my feelings before making requests of my time or energy. I want you to show interest in my life that isn't connected to what I can do for you. I paused, looking at each of them in turn. And I want you to understand that the days of me being automatically available for your convenience are over. I'm going to start living my own life, and that means I'm going to start saying no to things that don't serve my interests. What kinds of things? Michael asked nervously. Last-minute babysitting requests when you haven't bothered to call me in weeks, I said. Emergency loans for people who are perfectly capable of managing their own finances. Holiday gatherings where I do all the work and you do all the taking. I sat back down and looked at them seriously. I'm not cutting you out of my life. I'm inviting you into a healthier version of our relationship. But it's going to require you to see me differently and treat me differently. And if we don't, Sarah asked quietly, then you'll discover that the woman who raised you is stronger and more independent than you ever realized, I said. And you'll have to decide whether you want a relationship with the real me or whether you only valued the version of me that existed to serve your needs. The room fell silent again, but this time it felt different. Instead of the defensive, silence of people trying to figure out how to manipulate me back into compliance, it felt like the thoughtful silence of people genuinely considering what I had said. Finally, Michael spoke. Mom, I think I owe you an apology. I didn't realize how we've been treating you. But now that you've pointed it out, I can see it. I can see it too, Sarah said softly. And I'm ashamed of myself. Daniel nodded. Yeah, me too. I guess I just got so used to you always being there that I forgot you might have your own stuff going on. I felt a flicker of hope, but I was careful not to let it show too much on my face. Words were easy. Changed behavior would be the real test. I appreciate the apologies, I said. But what I really need is for things to change going forward. What would that look like? Michael asked. It would look like you calling me because you want to talk to me, not because you need something from me, I said. It would look like you including me in your lives because you enjoy my company, not because you need free childcare or emotional labor. It would look like you asking about my interests and supporting my dreams the way I've always supported yours, I continued. And it would look like you respecting my decisions about my own life, even when those decisions don't prioritize your convenience or your inheritance. Sarah leaned forward. Are you still planning to sell the house? I smiled. I don't know. Yet. I'm exploring my options. But I do know that whatever I decide, it will be based on what's best for me, not on what's most convenient for you. That's fair, Michael said, though I could see the effort it took him to say it. More than fair, Daniel added. It's what we should have been encouraging all along. I looked at my 3 children, seeing them more clearly than I had in years. They weren't evil people, and they hadn't set out to take advantage of me. They had simply fallen into patterns that benefited them, and I had enabled those patterns by never demanding better. There's something else we need to discuss, I said. The money. All 3 of them tensed visibly. I want you to understand that your inheritance is not guaranteed, I said calmly. Your father left that money to me, not to you. And while I hope to leave you something when I die, I'm not going to spend the rest of my life preserving wealth for people who don't value the person who earned it. Mom, Sarah started. I'm not threatening you, I interrupted. I'm setting a boundary. If you want to maintain a relationship with me that might eventually include financial inheritance, then you need to maintain a relationship with me that's based on love and respect, not on expectation and entitlement. I stood up again, signaling that the conversation was winding down. I'm going to give all of you some time to think about what we've discussed today. And I'm going to continue exploring my options for how I want to spend the rest of my life. What should we do? Daniel asked. Be my children, I said simply. Not my managers, not my financial advisors, not my guilt trippers. Just be people who love me and want me to be happy. As they filed out of the house, each of them giving me awkward hugs and promises to do better, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. The confrontation had been harder than I had expected, but it had also been more successful than I had hoped. For the first time in years, my children had heard me speak as myself rather than as their endlessly accommodating mother. That evening, I called Eleanor to tell her about the intervention. How do you feel? She asked after I had recounted the whole conversation. Tired, I said honestly, but also hopeful and terrified. That sounds about right, Eleanor said with a laugh. The good news is that they didn't just dismiss what you said, they actually seemed to hear you. Some of it anyway, I agreed. But I know the real test will be whether anything actually changes in how they treat me. Give them time, Eleanor advised. It took them years to develop these patterns, and it'll take time to break them. But you've planted the seed. Now you just have to be consistent about watering it. After we hung up, I sat in my living room and looked around at the house that had been my home for more than 30 years. The furniture Robert and I had chosen together, the photos of our children at various stages of their lives, the mementos from trips and celebrations and ordinary moments that had made up the fabric of our family life. I still didn't know whether I wanted to sell the house and move away. But for the first time since Robert's death, I felt like I had the freedom to make that choice based on what would make me happy, rather than what would be most convenient for other people. The fortress Robert had built wasn't just about money. It was about security, about having choices, about being able to live life on your own terms. For 5 years, I had been so focused on preserving that security for my children that I had forgotten it was meant to provide freedom for me. Now I was ready to claim that freedom, and my children would have to decide whether they wanted to be part of that journey or whether they preferred the version of their mother who had never asked for anything in return for everything she gave. The next few weeks would tell me everything I needed to know about which choice they would make. The silence after my children left felt different from any quiet I had experienced in my house before. It wasn't the heavy silence of grief or the hollow silence of loneliness. It was the anticipatory silence of someone waiting to see if words would translate into actions, if promises would become patterns, if relationships could truly change, or if they were too damaged to repair. I spent the next 3 days implementing my new boundaries in small but meaningful ways. When Sarah called Tuesday evening asking if I could pick up Emma from school because she had a client emergency, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not available tomorrow. You'll need to make other arrangements." The pause that followed was so long I wondered if the call had dropped, but eventually Sarah said, "Oh, okay, I'll figure something out." There was surprise in her voice, but not the anger I had expected. When Michael texted Wednesday morning asking me to review some investment documents for a client who reminded him of Dad, I responded with, "I'm flattered you value my opinion, but I'm not qualified to give financial advice to your clients. You should recommend they consult with a certified professional." Again, the response was puzzlement rather than hostility, though I could sense his confusion through the phone. Daniel's test came when he showed up unannounced Thursday afternoon, with a bag of laundry and his usual assumption that I would welcome the interruption to my day. I met him at the door but didn't invite him in. "I'm actually heading out," I said, which was true. I had plans to visit an art supply store and browse through some classes offered at the community college. "Can I just throw this stuff in your washer?" he asked, holding up the bag. "My machine is broken again." "There's a laundromat on Elm Street," I said gently, "or you could call a repair service for your machine." Daniel blinked at me as if I had started speaking a foreign language. "But it would only take a minute to start a load here." "Daniel," I said, maintaining my calm tone, "I'm not running a free laundry service. If your machine is broken, you need to take responsibility for finding a solution that doesn't involve me dropping everything to help you." He stood there for a moment, looking genuinely bewildered, as if the concept of me not being available for his convenience was completely foreign to him, which I realized it was. "Okay," he said finally. "I guess I'll hit the laundromat." These small victories gave me confidence, but the real test came on Friday when I received a call that would reveal just how deep my children's sense of entitlement truly ran. It was Jennifer, Michael's wife, and her voice had the carefully modulated tone of someone who had been coached on exactly what to say. "Linda, hi, it's Jennifer. I hope you don't mind me calling directly." "Of course not," I said, though I was immediately suspicious. Jennifer and I had always had a cordial relationship, but she had never called me independently before. "Michael told me about your conversation earlier this week," she continued, "and I just wanted to say that I think it's wonderful that you're focusing on yourself more. You deserve to be happy." I waited for the other shoe to drop. "The thing is," Jennifer said, her voice becoming more tentative, "we have a situation with the kids' private school tuition. There was some confusion with the payment plan, and we're facing a pretty significant penalty if we can't resolve it by Monday." And there it was. The real test of whether my family had heard anything I said about changing our relationship dynamics. "I'm sorry to hear that's stressful for you," I said neutrally. "Well, we were hoping you might be able to help us out just this once. It's $15,000, and Michael says you mentioned having liquid assets available for things that are important to you. We thought, since the kids' education is important to all of us." The manipulation was so transparent it would have been insulting if it weren't so predictable. Jennifer was attempting to reframe their financial irresponsibility as something that should matter to me, using my grandchildren as leverage to open my wallet. "Jennifer," I said calmly, "I need to ask you something, and I'd appreciate an honest answer. Before this tuition crisis arose, when was the last time you or Michael invited me to spend time with the children? Not asked me to babysit them, but actually included me in their lives because you thought I would enjoy their company." There was a long pause. "Well, we had you over for dinner a few months ago." "That was 6 months ago, and it was because you needed me to watch the kids while you went to a work party," I corrected gently. "You picked me up, had me babysit for 4 hours, and then drove me home. We barely spoke except about bedtime routines and emergency contacts. Well, we've been so busy with work and the kids' activities." "I understand that you're busy," I said, "but I need you to understand something. Michael came to me for money to pay for your children's education without having made any effort to include me in their actual lives. That tells me that you see me as a bank, not as a grandmother." "That's not true," Jennifer protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Let me ask you another question," I continued. "Can you tell me what grade Emma is in now?" Silence. "Can you tell me what subject David is struggling with this year?" More silence. "Can you tell me what either of your children wants to be when they grow up?" "Linda, I don't see what this has to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," I interrupted. "You're asking me to invest $15,000 in the education of children I've been systematically excluded from knowing. You want me to care about their academic success while showing no interest in whether I have any kind of meaningful relationship with them. I could hear Jennifer breathing heavily through the phone, and I suspected she was realizing that this conversation wasn't going the way she had expected. The answer is no, I said clearly. I won't be contributing to the tuition payment. But Linda, these are your grandchildren. Don't you want what's best for them? I want what's best for them, I agreed, which includes having parents who take responsibility for their own financial commitments instead of running to grandma every time they mismanage their money. It wasn't mismanagement, Jennifer said defensively. There was a miscommunication with the school's billing department. Then you should work with the school to resolve the miscommunication, I replied. That's what responsible adults do when they encounter billing errors. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling a mixture of sadness and liberation. Sadness because the call had confirmed that my children viewed me primarily as a financial resource. Liberation because I had successfully maintained my boundaries, even when they used my grandchildren as emotional leverage. The real revelation came that evening when my phone rang again. This time it was Michael, and he was furious. Mom, Jennifer told me about your conversation today. I can't believe you would take out your frustrations with us on our children. I'm not taking anything out on anyone, I said calmly. I'm simply declining to solve a problem that isn't mine to solve. Those kids are your grandchildren, Michael said, his voice rising. You're punishing them for whatever issues you think you have with us. Michael, when was the last time you brought the children to visit me without needing me to babysit? Them. That's not the point, he said, clearly frustrated that I wasn't engaging with his guilt trip. It's exactly the point, I replied. You want me to feel financially responsible for children I'm not allowed to be emotionally connected to. You want me to invest in their futures while being excluded from their presents. You're not excluded, Michael protested. You're always welcome to see them. Am I? Because every time I've suggested getting together with them, you've either been too busy or you've turned it into a babysitting request. When I asked to take Emma to the art museum last month, you said she was too busy with activities. When I suggested having David spend a weekend with me this summer, you said he was too young to be away from home overnight. Those were legitimate concerns, Michael said defensively. Were they? Or were you protecting your children from spending unsupervised time with their grandmother because you were afraid I might tell them things about their family history that don't fit the narrative you prefer? There was a long pause, and I could practically hear Michael's mind racing as he tried to figure out how to respond to that accusation. What's that supposed to mean? He finally asked. It means I think you've been controlling my access to my grandchildren the same way you've been controlling everything else in this family, I said. You want me available when it's convenient for you, but you don't want me to have any real influence or independence. That's ridiculous, Michael said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. Is it? Then why don't you ever leave them children alone with me? Why do all our interactions have to be supervised and structured around your needs? Why have you never asked me what kind of relationship I'd like to have with them? Another pause, longer this time. Michael, I said, more gently, I love those children and I want to be part of their lives. But I won't be blackmailed into funding their education when I'm not allowed to be their grandmother in any meaningful way. So, what do you want? He asked, and for the first time in the conversation, he sounded more tired than angry. I want to spend time with Emma and David without it being about childcare, I said. I want to take them places and teach them things and be someone they actually know, not just someone who sends birthday cards and Christmas presents. And if we arrange that, Michael said carefully, would you reconsider helping with the tuition? I almost laughed at the transparency of the transaction he was proposing, but I managed to keep my voice steady. Michael, do you hear yourself? Right now? You're literally trying to negotiate access to your own children in exchange for money. That's not what I'm doing, he said quickly. That's exactly what you're doing. I replied. And the fact that you don't see anything wrong with that tells me everything I need to know about how you view our relationship. I could hear Jennifer's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Michael put his hand over the phone for a moment, then came back on the line. Mom, we need to resolve this tuition situation by Monday. Can we please just focus on that for now and deal with the other stuff later? The other stuff, I repeated. You mean my feelings and my need for authentic relationships with my family members? That's just other stuff to you? I didn't mean it like that, Michael said, but we both knew he had. I'm going to hang up now, I said. When you're ready to have a conversation about building a real relationship between me and your children that isn't contingent on my financial contributions, you know where to find me. I ended the call and immediately turned off my phone. I needed time to process what had just happened without being bombarded by more calls and messages from my children. The weekend that followed was the most peaceful I had experienced in years. With my phone turned off and my boundaries firmly in place, I was free to focus on my own interests without constant interruption. I visited 3 art galleries, attended a lecture on European travel for seniors, and had a long lunch with Eleanor where we discussed everything from books to politics to the challenges of reinventing yourself in your 60s. How are you feeling about the tuition situation? Eleanor asked over coffee and dessert. Sad but not surprised, I said honestly. It confirmed what I suspected about how they really see me. And how do you see yourself now? She asked. I thought about that question as I watched other diners enjoying their Saturday afternoon meals. Couples talking animatedly, families with children who seemed genuinely engaged with each other, groups of friends laughing and sharing stories. I see myself as someone who has choices, I said finally. For the first time in years, I feel like I have agency in my own life. That's powerful, Eleanor said, and scary, I imagine. Terrifying, I agreed, but also exhilarating. When I turned my phone back on Sunday evening, there were 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. Most were from my children, but there were also messages from Jennifer, from Sarah's ex-husband asking me to talk sense into the family, and even one from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who had apparently been enlisted to check on my well-being. The escalation told me everything I needed to know about how seriously my family took the threat to their access to my money. They had mobilized an entire network of people to pressure me back into compliance. I scrolled through the messages without reading most of them, but one from Sarah caught my attention. Mom, please call me. We need to talk about what's really going on here. I called her back, curious about what new approach she might have. Developed. Thank God, she said when she answered. I've been worried sick. Where have you been? I've been living my life, I said simply. Something I apparently need to schedule around your family's needs. Mom, Michael told me about the tuition thing. I think there might be some misunderstanding. What kind of misunderstanding? Well, I think you might be seeing this as being about money when it's really about family, Sarah said, clearly having rehearsed this approach. Sarah, they asked me for $15,000 for a problem they created themselves, without having made any effort to include me in my grandchildren's lives in a meaningful way. How exactly am I misunderstanding the situation? Maybe they could have handled it better, Sarah admitted. But the important thing is that Emma and David get to stay in their school. Surely that matters more than hurt feelings about not being invited to more family dinners. The casual dismissal of my feelings as unimportant compared to their financial needs was so typical of how my children had learned to think about me that I almost wasn't surprised. Almost. Sarah, I said carefully, do you think it's reasonable for Michael and Jennifer to expect me to pay for their children's education when they don't allow me to have any unsupervised time with those children? It's not that they don't allow it, Sarah said defensively. It's just that kids today have such busy schedules, and Michael and Jennifer want to make sure that I don't have any real influence in their lives, I finished. That I remain a checkbook rather than a grandmother. That's not fair, Sarah protested. What's not fair is asking me to fund the lives of children I'm not permitted to know, I replied. What's not fair is expecting me to care about their academic success when no one cares about my emotional needs. Your emotional needs? Sarah's voice took on the slightly exasperated tone she used when she thought someone was being unreasonable. Mom, you have a comfortable life. You have a beautiful house, financial security, and children who love you. What more do you need emotionally? The question was so revealing that it took my breath away for a moment. Sarah genuinely couldn't understand what I might need beyond material comfort and the abstract concept of being loved by people who never demonstrated that love through their actions. I need to feel valued for who I am, not what I can provide, I said quietly. I need to have relationships where my happiness matters as much as yours. I need to be seen as a person with my own interests and dreams, not just as a resource for other people to use. But you are valued, Sarah said, sounding genuinely confused. We couldn't manage our lives without you. Exactly, I said. You value what I do for you, not who I am. And that's the problem. There was a long pause, and when Sarah spoke again, her voice had changed. Mom, are you having some kind of breakdown? Because this doesn't sound like you at all. The suggestion that my desire for authentic relationships was evidence of mental instability was both insulting and predictable. It was easier for my children to believe I was having a breakdown than to examine their own behavior and consider the possibility that they had been treating me badly. I'm not having a breakdown, I said firmly. I'm having a breakthrough. I'm finally seeing clearly how our family dynamics actually work, and I'm deciding that I deserve better. What does that mean exactly? Sarah asked, and I could hear the worry creeping into her voice. It means that the days of me being automatically available for your convenience are over, I said. It means that if you want my financial help with something, you need to have invested in a real relationship with me first. It means that I'm going to start living my own life instead of existing solely to support yours. And if we don't like the new terms? Sarah asked quietly. Then you'll discover that you never really knew your mother at all, I said. And you'll have to decide whether you want to get to know the real me or whether you prefer to remember the version of me that never asked for anything in return. After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking around at the life Robert and I had built together. The photos of our children at various stages of their lives, the mementos from family vacations and celebrations, the comfortable furniture we had chosen for a house where we planned to grow old together. All of it was still there, but it felt different now. Instead of being surrounded by memories of a loving family, I felt like I was sitting in a museum dedicated to illusions I had maintained for too long. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 5 years. I made plans that were entirely for my own enjoyment, without considering anyone else's schedule or needs. I booked a week-long art retreat in Vermont for the following month. I signed up for an Italian language class that met twice a week. I made appointments to visit 4 different retirement communities, not because I had decided to move, but because I wanted to understand all my options. Each decision felt like a small act of rebellion against the role I had been playing for so long. For the first time since Robert's death, I was thinking about what I wanted rather than what other people needed from me. The retreat was non-refundable. The language class required a semester commitment. The retirement community visits would take me away for entire days when my children might need something from me. All of it felt terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. That afternoon, I called my lawyer to update my will. Not because I was planning to disinherit my children, but because I wanted to ensure that my money would be distributed in a way that reflected my values rather than their expectations. I established a scholarship fund for art students at the local community college. I made substantial donations to the women's shelter where Robert and I had volunteered together. I set aside money for a trust that would support my grandchildren's education, but only if they maintained regular contact with me and could demonstrate that they actually knew me as a person. The remainder would go to my children, but only after they completed a family counseling program designed to help them understand how their behavior had affected our relationships. It wasn't punishment, it was education. And it was my way of ensuring that Robert's money would be used to build the kind of family he had always wanted us to be, rather than enabling the dysfunction we had become. When I finished signing the documents, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. For the first time in 5 years, I was taking control of my own story, instead of letting other people write it for me. My children were about to discover that their mother was far more complex, far more intelligent, and far more determined than they had ever imagined. And they were going to have to decide whether they wanted to know that woman or whether they preferred to lose her entirely. The morning I left for my art retreat in Vermont marked exactly 6 weeks since that rainy day at Robert's grave. As I loaded my suitcase into the car, I felt like I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind the woman who had spent 5 years shrinking herself to fit into other people's expectations. The woman driving to Vermont was someone I was still getting to know, but I liked her already. My phone had been unusually quiet for the past week. After the confrontation about the tuition money, my children seemed to have entered a phase of strategic silence, perhaps hoping that if they withdrew their attention, I would panic and return to my old patterns of desperate accommodation. Instead, their absence felt like a gift. For the first time in years, I could think clearly without the constant noise of their needs and demands clouding my judgment. The art retreat was everything I had hoped it would be and more. Nestled in the mountains among trees that were just beginning their autumn transformation, the center was filled with people who had come to explore their creativity without apology or explanation. Some were like me, older individuals reclaiming passions that had been set aside for family responsibilities. Others were younger artists taking time to develop their skills and vision. What united us all was the understanding that art mattered, that personal expression was valuable, that taking time for yourself wasn't selfish but necessary. I hadn't painted seriously since college, but the muscle memory returned quickly once I stood before an easel with a brush in my hand. The instructor, a woman named Claire who was probably my age, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her right to take up space in the world, encouraged us to paint not what we saw, but what we felt. My first painting was a landscape, but not of the Vermont mountains surrounding us. Instead, I found myself recreating the view from my kitchen window, the garden Robert and I had planted together, but painted in the colors of freedom rather than memory. The roses were wild and overgrown, spilling beyond their traditional boundaries. The sky was vast and open, full of possibilities rather than clouds. When I stepped back to look at what I had created, I saw not the past I was mourning, but the future I was building. "That's powerful," Claire said, studying my work. "There's liberation in every brushstroke." On the 3rd day of the retreat, I received a call from Daniel. I almost didn't answer, but something in his tone when he left, a voicemail made me curious enough to call him back. "Mom, I've been thinking about our conversation," he said, and he sounded different somehow. Less cavalier, more thoughtful than I was used to hearing from him. "What about it?" I asked, continuing to clean my brushes while we talked. "I think I owe you more than an apology," he said. "I think I owe you an explanation of how I got so messed up in my thinking about you." This was unexpected. Of my 3 children, Daniel had always been the least analytical, the most likely to drift through difficult conversations without really engaging with their substance. "I'm listening," I said. "I was thinking about what you said, about how we only call when we need something, and I realized that's exactly what I do. But I also realized why I do it." He paused, and I could hear him taking a deep breath. "After Dad died, you became like this superhero figure to me. Nothing ever rattled you. Nothing was ever too much trouble. You always had solutions for everything. And I guess I started thinking of you as this inexhaustible resource rather than as a person who might have her own problems and needs. I set down my brushes and gave him my full attention. I think, Daniel continued, that it was easier for me to see you that way than to deal with the fact that you were probably struggling just as much as we were, maybe more. If I acknowledged that you were hurting too, then I would have had to figure out how to take care of you, and I was barely managing to take care of myself. This was the most mature thing I had ever heard Daniel say, and it took me completely by surprise. So instead of seeing you as a person who was grieving Dad and trying to figure out how to rebuild her life, I saw you as this pillar of strength who existed primarily to help the rest of us figure out our lives. Daniel, I said softly, that's a very insightful observation. Yeah, well, it took me long enough to figure it out, he said ruefully. And the thing is, I don't think it was just me. I think we all did it, maybe for different reasons. But we all turned you into this caricature of the perfect mother instead of seeing you as Linda, the actual person. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, not from sadness, but from relief. Finally, one of my children was seeing me clearly. What made you realize all this? I asked. Honestly, I was talking to my therapist about the whole family situation, and she asked me to describe you as a person, not as my mother. And I realized I couldn't do it. I couldn't tell her what you like to do for fun, what your dreams are, what makes you laugh. I know you as a function, not as a human being. The admission was both heartbreaking and hopeful. She also pointed out that the way I've been treating you is probably similar to how I treat women I date, expecting them to take care of my emotional needs without reciprocating, which explains why my relationships never last very long. I couldn't help but smile at that. Daniel's pattern of brief, intense relationships had always puzzled me, but his therapist's observation made perfect sense. So what I want to know, Daniel said, is whether you'd be willing to start over with me. Not as my mother who exists to solve my problems, but as Linda, who happens to be my mother but is also her own person with her own life. What would that look like? I asked. I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. But maybe I could start by asking you about your art retreat instead of immediately launching into whatever crisis I'm dealing with this week. I'd like that, I said. And so we talked for 20 minutes about painting and creativity and the mountains and the other people at the retreat. Daniel asked thoughtful questions and shared stories about his own artistic struggles. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to an adult child rather than to a grown-up toddler who saw me primarily as a source of comfort and resources. When we hung up, I felt a cautious optimism about the possibility that at least one of my children might be capable of real change. The optimism was short-lived. That evening, I received a very different kind of call from Michael. Mom, we need to talk about this will situation, he said without preamble. What will situation? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew what he was referring to. Don't play dumb, Michael said, his voice tight with anger. I know you went to see Harold Brennan last week. His secretary mentioned it when I ran into her at the bank. Harold Brennan was indeed my lawyer, and apparently Millbrook was still a small enough town that my legal affairs couldn't remain entirely private. My will is my business, Michael, I said calmly. Not when you're making changes based on some temporary family drama, he shot back. Mom, you're being manipulated by whatever midlife crisis you're going through, and you're making decisions that are going to affect all of us. The accusation that I was the one being manipulated was so absurd that I almost laughed. Michael, can you hear yourself right now? You're angry that I might be making decisions about my own money without consulting you first. Do you understand how entitled that sounds? It's not about entitlement, Michael said, though his tone suggested otherwise. It's about making sure you don't do something you'll regret later when you're thinking more clearly. I'm thinking more clearly now than I have in years, I replied. And what I'm thinking is that my children have been taking advantage of my grief and my desire to maintain family connections to treat me like their personal bank and unpaid employee. That's not true, Michael protested, but there was less conviction in his voice than there had been in previous conversations. Isn't it? When was the last time any of you called to ask how I was doing without wanting something from me? When was the last time any of you included me in your lives because you enjoyed my company rather than because you needed free labor? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Mom, maybe we haven't been as attentive as we should have been, but that doesn't mean you should rewrite your will to punish us. I'm not punishing anyone, I said. I'm ensuring that my money goes to people and causes that actually value what I valued. And I'm making sure that if my children want to benefit from their father's hard work, they'll have to demonstrate that they actually knew and cared about the woman he worked so hard to provide for. What does that mean exactly? Michael asked, and I could hear the fear creeping into his voice. It means that before anyone inherits a significant amount of money from me, they'll need to prove that they know me as a person, not just as a source of financial support, I said. It means they'll need to show that they've made an effort to have a real relationship with me based on mutual respect and genuine affection. And if we can't prove that to your satisfaction, Michael asked, then the money goes to people and organizations that did value me, I said simply. The Art Scholarship Fund at the community college, the women's shelter where your father and I volunteered, various charities that work with causes I care about. You can't be serious, Michael said, his voice rising. You're going to give away Dad's life insurance money to strangers instead of to your own children? I'm going to give Robert's money to people who embody the values he and I shared, I corrected. Kindness, generosity, respect for others, community service. If my children demonstrate those values in their relationships with me, then they'll inherit as planned. If they don't, then the money will go to people who do. The silence that followed was so complete, I wondered if Michael had hung up. Mom, he finally said, and his voice was quieter now, more serious. What exactly would we need to do to prove that we know you and care about you? It was the first time in our entire conversation that he had asked what I wanted, rather than arguing about what he thought I should want. You could start by spending time with me that isn't about needing something from me, I said. You could ask about my interests and actually listen to the answers. You could include me in your children's lives in meaningful ways, not just as emergency childcare. You could treat me like someone whose happiness matters to you. And if we do those things, Michael said carefully, you'll change the will back? I sighed. Even when he was trying to understand what I wanted, Michael was still primarily focused on the financial implications. Michael, I don't want you to have a relationship with me because you're worried about your inheritance. I want you to have a relationship with me because you love me and value my presence in your life. I do love you, Michael said, sounding genuinely hurt. Of course I love you. Then show me, I said simply. Don't tell me you love me while treating me like hired help. Don't say you value me while ignoring my feelings. Don't claim you care about me while only calling when you need something. When I returned from Vermont, I found my house exactly as I had left it, but I felt like I was seeing it through new eyes. The rooms that had felt heavy with memories now seemed full of potential. The garden that had reminded me daily of loss now looked like a space where new things could grow. I also found 14 messages on my answering machine, mostly from my children but also from Jennifer, from Sarah's ex-husband, and from 2 of my neighbors who had apparently been recruited to check on my well-being while I was away. I deleted most of the messages without listening to them completely, but I did call Eleanor to let her know I was back. How do you feel? She asked after I had given her a brief summary of the retreat and the conversations with my children. Different, I said honestly. Stronger, but also sadder. I think I'm finally grieving not just for Robert, but for the family I thought I had. That's healthy, Eleanor said. You can't build something real on a foundation of illusions. Daniel seems to be genuinely trying to change, I told her. But Michael and Sarah are still primarily focused on the money. Give them time, Eleanor advised. Some people need to lose something before they can appreciate what they had. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a new routine that felt more authentic than anything I had experienced since Robert's death. I attended my Italian language classes twice a week and found myself looking forward to them with an enthusiasm. That surprised me. I spent mornings in my garden, not just maintaining what Robert and I had planted, but adding new elements that reflected my evolving tastes and interests. I also began volunteering at the women's shelter where Robert and I had worked together. But now I was there as Linda rather than as half of a couple. The work felt different, more personal somehow, as I helped women who were rebuilding their lives after difficult relationships. I saw my own journey reflected in their struggles and triumphs. My social life expanded in ways that would have been impossible when I was constantly available for my children's needs. I joined a book club, started attending lectures at the local library, and even went on a few casual dates with men I met through various activities. Nothing serious, but it was refreshing to discover that I was still capable of connecting with new people. The most significant change was in how I spent my evenings. Instead of sitting alone in my living room waiting for phone calls that might or might not come, I filled my time with activities that interested me. I painted, I read, I planned trips, I researched causes I wanted to support. For the first time, in years, I felt like I was living rather than simply existing. Daniel kept his word about trying to build a different kind of relationship with me. He called regularly. Not because he needed something, but because he wanted to talk. He asked about my paintings, my Italian lessons, my volunteer work. He shared details about his own life that went beyond his immediate needs and crises. Slowly, carefully, we began to know each other as adults, rather than as mother and dependent child. Michael and Sarah, however, seemed to be struggling with the new dynamics. They continued to call, but their conversations had an awkward, forced quality, as if they were following a script someone else had written. They asked about my activities, but I could tell they were going through the motions rather than feeling genuine interest. They made efforts to include me in family activities, but the invitations felt calculated rather than spontaneous. The real test came in December when Sarah called to invite me to Emma's Christmas pageant at school. It's on December 15th. At 7 p.m., she said. I thought you might like to come. I'd love to, I said, genuinely pleased. Thank you for thinking of me. But when December 15th arrived and I showed up at the school, I discovered that Sarah hadn't actually made arrangements for me to sit with the family. She seemed surprised to see me and scrambled to find me a seat near the back while she and her ex-husband sat together in the front row with other parents. After the performance, as families gathered to congratulate their children, Sarah approached me with an awkward smile. Thanks for coming, Mom. I know Emma was excited to see you here. But when I looked around for Emma to congratulate her, she was already leaving with her father, and Sarah made no effort to facilitate a conversation between us. It was clear that Sarah had invited me as a gesture, a box to check on her list of things she needed to do to maintain her inheritance prospects, rather than because she wanted me to be part of Emma's special moment. I drove home that evening, feeling disappointed but not surprised. Sarah was trying to do the right thing, but she was doing it for the wrong reasons, and the difference showed in every interaction. The contrast with Daniel's approach was striking. When he invited me to his art opening in January, he picked me up personally, introduced me to his friends as someone he was proud to have there, and spent genuine time with me throughout the evening. He wasn't performing the role of dutiful son. He was sharing an important moment with someone he cared about. By spring, the new patterns in my family relationships had solidified. Daniel and I had developed a genuine friendship that honored both our familial connection and our individual identities. Michael and Sarah continued to make efforts, but their interactions with me remained transactional, motivated more by financial concerns than by authentic affection. I wasn't surprised, therefore, when Michael called in April to ask if we could have lunch to discuss the family situation. We met at a restaurant we had been to many times before, but the atmosphere between us was different now. Michael seemed nervous in a way I had never seen him, and he spent several minutes making small talk before getting to the point of our meeting. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything that's happened over the past year," he said finally. "And I want you to know that I understand why you were upset with us." "Do you?" I asked, genuinely curious about what conclusion he had reached. "I think we took you for granted," he said carefully. "We got used to having you available whenever we needed help, and we didn't consider how that might make you feel." It was a reasonable summary, as far as it went, but it still framed the problem in terms of my feelings rather than their behavior. "I also think," Michael continued, "that we could do a better job of including you in our lives in ways that aren't just about needing help with something." "That would be nice," I said neutrally. Michael leaned forward slightly. "So I was wondering if you might consider modifying the will situation. Not going back to the original version necessarily, but maybe something that gives us credit for the efforts we've been making to rebuild our relationship." And there it was. The real reason for lunch. The bottom line that Michael had been building toward throughout our conversation. He had analyzed the situation, determined what changes he needed to make to secure his inheritance, and was now negotiating for a better deal. "Michael," I said gently, "do you understand the difference between what you're doing right now and what Daniel has been doing?" Michael looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean?" "Daniel isn't trying to earn his inheritance," I said. "He's trying to know his mother. He's not calculating what he needs to do to get back in my good graces. He's building a relationship with me because he values who I am as a person." "But we all value you," Michael protested. "No," I said sadly. "You value what I can do for you. You value my availability, my financial resources, my willingness to provide support without expecting anything in return. But you don't value me." Michael's face flushed. "That's not fair. I'm here, aren't I? I'm trying to spend time with you and show that I care." "You're here because you're worried about your inheritance," I said calmly. "If I had no money to leave you, would you be making the same effort to rebuild our relationship?" The question hung between us, and Michael's inability to answer it immediately told me everything I needed to know. "That's what I thought," I said, reaching for my purse to pay for lunch. "Mom, wait," Michael said desperately. "Maybe I have been focused on the money, but that doesn't mean I don't care about you. Can't we find some middle ground here?" I looked at my eldest son, this man I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and I felt a deep sadness for all the ways we had failed each other. "Michael, I'm not looking for middle ground," I said. "I'm looking for authenticity. I'm looking for relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than on obligation and expectation." "And if I can't give you that?" he asked, quietly. "Then you've made your choice," I said. "And I've made mine." I left him sitting at the restaurant table, probably calculating how much money his inability to genuinely love his mother was going to cost him. That evening, I called my lawyer to make one final modification to my will. The scholarship fund and charitable donations remained the same. Daniel's inheritance remained substantial, reflecting the genuine relationship we had built. But for Michael and Sarah, I added one additional requirement. Before they could inherit anything beyond a token amount, they would need to complete a year of family therapy focused specifically on understanding how their behavior had affected our relationship. Not couples therapy or individual therapy, but family therapy designed to help them see me as a person rather than as a resource. If they were willing to do that work, if they were willing to examine their own behavior and make genuine changes, then they could inherit as originally planned. If they weren't, then their portions would join the scholarship fund and help other people pursue their dreams. It wasn't punishment. It was an opportunity for growth, for healing, for becoming the kind of people their father would have been proud to call his children. As I signed the documents, I realized that I was finally at peace with whatever choice they made. I had done everything I could to show them another way of being in relationship. Whether they chose to take that path was up to them. Later that evening, as I sat in my garden watching the sunset behind the roses Robert and I had planted so many years ago, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. It had started with abandonment, with standing alone in the rain while the people I loved most drove away from me. But it had become something much more powerful, a reclamation of my own agency, my own worth, my own right to be seen and valued for who I truly was. I was no longer the woman who had been left at that graveside. I was no longer the woman who accepted crumbs of attention and called it love. I was Linda Thompson, 63 years old, artist, volunteer, student of Italian, lover of books and travel and meaningful conversation. I was a woman who had learned to put herself first without feeling guilty, who had discovered that she was interesting and capable and worthy of respect. My children would have to decide whether they wanted to know that woman or whether they preferred to remember the version of me that had never asked for anything in return for everything she gave. Either way, I would be fine, because for the first time since Robert's death, I was complete in myself, not waiting for other people to validate my worth or define my happiness. The fortress Robert had built had indeed become my liberation, not just financially, but emotionally and psychologically. I was free to be myself, free to make my own choices, free to demand the kind of love I deserved, rather than settling for the kind of love other people were willing to give. And that freedom, I realized, was the greatest inheritance I could have received. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.